in addition to caring for your patients day to day, you obviously have this leadership role with COA and other leadership roles. What are some of your priorities stepping into this COA role more recently, and what do you look forward to most as part of this role in coming years?
So my fundamental priority is to provide access to care at an affordable rate closer to home. That's the foundation of what I work every day. And now I'm expanding that into disparity space because COVID-19 global pandemic health emergency has kind of exposed the crack in the healthcare delivery where we are seeing the unusually high number of patients of ethnic as well as social minorities, if we call social disparities of health, have much higher risk of getting COVID and deaths if they get one. So the way I see is that we are part of the ecosystem that has a kind of trusteeship of being the steward of federal and private funding to ensure that we preserve the access to care, get the access to clinical trial, bring medicines to the patients rather than expecting them to go somewhere else. The biggest surprise I have, Christina, is that I can order my chai latte from my hometown and get it delivered in my house here in 3 days. I can order neem tree, or we can have someone move the Land Rover or maybe Path Ranger on the Mars, but we can't find patients treatment in where they live. I mean, what kind of disparity do we have where a patient living in very affluent area has a different level of treatment compared to someone living in South Carolina in the broadband deserts? We need to bridge that gap.
Yeah. And since you brought up COVID-19, I know you recently facilitated a panel with Dr. Deborah Patt on disparities in cancer care and sources and solutions. I guess building upon inequities that COVID has further deepened, what are some other tangible things that you've observed that need to be addressed?
So COVID again has kind of exposed the two level of care or tale of two Americas, where one America has much more affluent, much more kind of classy care, and the other America has. So, and in multiple studies, if you look into the American Association of Cancer Research disparity report in 2020, their conclusion is that 1 in 3 American is dying with cancer between age of 25 and I think 74, simply because we are not able to address disparities. So coming back to COVID, while it's kind of I would call it a blessing in disguise, where it has opened up our eyes. What can we do not only to improve the outcomes, but also to reduce the expenditure? In their conclusion, AACR report indicated that we could be saving $230 billion a year if we paid attention to some of the preventable disparities. And that's multiple. I think it's racial, it's economic, it's social, but multiple things put together that we need to be cognizant about.
How do you see the Community Oncology Alliance helping address, some of those preventable disparities, Dr. Patel?
So Community Oncology Alliance is, first of all, is patients advocate organization, but it's run by doctors, oncologists. So we actually try to ensure that all the legislative activity that takes place in DC, they keep in mind the access to care for the remotest part, patient living in the remotest part. That's one. Second is we want to bring medicines to where patients live. I cannot expect my 85-year-old Black woman to travel to different parts of the state to get treatment. And third thing is that we need to bring access to clinical trial. One of the reasons why we see so much disparity is there is no access to clinical trials. They're all focused on highly urbanized, highly organized, structured areas. And there are financial incentive for people to do that as well. As against that, practice in rural areas do not have any financial support from other NIH or anywhere else to do clinical trial, and which is what is worsening disparities. What I also realized, Christina, is that there's the Human Genome Project, how the federal government across the world decided to bring personalized medicine initiative to all the patients using precision medicine. But the Genome Wide Association study showed that up until 2018, out of 100 patients, I think 35 million samples were analyzed, almost only 2% of that of Black Americans. So if we do not know the genome structure of the minorities, how can we develop drugs? If we don't develop drugs, how can we be fair and equitable to provide that care? Biologically, you are different than me. Everybody else is different. So we need to be cognizant of the comprehensive genomic profiling, pharmacogenomic, germline mutations. All of this has to be a part of the ecosystem that evaluates the person in individual capacity, and then what can we do to help them.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Patel, it sounds like enabling access to clinical trials, particularly in the community and more rural settings, would be a great first step. Do you see this starting to happen?
That's not happening as yet. And unfortunately, it actually happened the other way around. We were part of NCI's initiative called CTSU, Community Trial Support Unit. Mm-hmm. They were giving us some sort of support to enable us to do trials in our clinic. They were like cooperative group trials. But somehow the program was closed in 2008, and the whole grant was shifted to large kind of health systems. So we had to then start paying money back to those. I said, those institutions get funding from federal government, and they started double dipping. They said we had to pay money to be part of that and corporate. I said, no, I have principal objection to that. Mm-hmm. So we stopped doing all the trial because it was not feasible for us to do trial. And I would say that a third of the practice like that of ours cannot afford to do trials. So billions of dollars goes into trials, but they don't go to where the patients are. They really go to where the patients are.
What do you consider to have been the 2 or 3 most influential evolutions that have taken place in oncology?
Oh, awesome. So we can look at the ecosystem perspective and the micro and macro. So on the macro level, the oncology care model or the value-based care concept taught us how do we define the value. So even though there was no translation into the monetary saving, the findings did conclude that there was overwhelming, excellent patient experience. It also gave us a roadmap of how do we define value for the patients. Mm-hmm. For example, opening up access as and when patient needs to reduce hospitalization. And the matter is when you have a 45-year-old single mother who's a typical patient with breast cancer, has fever at 7 p.m. on Thursday night, by getting her right access to urgent care and then taking action rather than expecting her to go to ER, you reduce her risk of going to hospital. But if she did not go because we did not have care coordination after hours, and she would end up in the ER, she'll spend 12 hours there. Her 3 kids not knowing what's happening to mama will be crying at home. She would have to lose 3 days of her work. She'll have to take care of the kind of, childcare for 3 days. And these are the impact that we have to look into value-based care. And this is what value-based care has taught us as to how do we define the value to human being. I can save $10 million, but if it did not translate to a person to whom it's meant to be, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So that's one part. On the micro side, when you look into the targeted therapies, the precision medicine, and the CAR T-cell therapies. So we are shifting away from the traditional concept of cytotoxic chemotherapy, which is more of what we call the napalm bombing versus using the smart bombs. That ecosystem now, we know that we are able to find ALK, ROS, MAD, multiple mutations and develop drugs accordingly. It not only reduces the side effects profile, it also in the long run will improve the quality of care.
You mentioned also specifically cell and gene therapy as an area of innovation. And cell and gene therapy is interesting because historically so far in the community setting, it's particularly inaccessible. So I guess, what are your thoughts on the promise of this in the community and the ability for cell and gene therapy to expand into larger community networks over time?
So it's very interesting kind of debate, and I've always believed that whatever is right for my patients, we do that. So, for example, we work with the Atrium Health System and a couple of other places that have CAR T cell and cell and gene therapy available. And anytime I see a patient who's clinically appropriate or appropriate patient or clinical trial, I always pick up a phone and call Dr. Ghosh or Dr. Kudus in nearby areas and see if I can get them where they need to be. Uh, Coming back to again, a lot of patients may not have access to transport. And then just give an example, I had a 78-year-old female patient living in a very rural part of South Carolina. I wanted her to come to my another office crossing the state line. And she said, I'm afraid of crossing the state line. I cannot be there. So there are some challenges. So if we do not democratize the smaller center to be able to offer cell and gene therapy, the true utility will be again restricted to people, your resources to transport or to live in the bigger cities. And it's simply the economic reality of life as well.
Mm-hmm. And are you encouraged by the promise of allogeneic therapies that may have potentially less travel burden?
Absolutely, absolutely. So if there is no travel burden, it probably would be a lot more like bite therapy. All of those therapies, I think what I feel is that there is going to be, again, democratization. And, we all, I used to be a transplanter in one lifetime. We all have done it. We don't do it right now because I feel that, somebody else does it efficiently. I'll send my patients there. But I've seen the resistance and reluctance from some of my patients simply because of the travel logistics. And
Mm-hmm.
it may, $50 may not sound a whole lot of money to me and you, but if a patient has to spend $50 4 times a week going for a follow-up to tertiary care center just within 50-mile radius, still a lot of money. And then most of these patients have old rugged truck that kind of gives 8 miles a gallon. So if they drive a truck 60 miles one way, 120 miles plus parking, it takes essentially their days earning out of their pocket.
Thinking more broadly, what do you feel could further enable the delivery of it from a regulatory, community capability, or manufacturer perspective?
So what's coming is next wave is the disparity again. I think regulators will start looking into, does your studies have reflection of real world data? So if you look into most of the clinical trials, they look at patients with BMI of less than 25. That eliminates 90% of the Black American population from the clinical trial. And the results may not be applicable to real world life. And that's the reason why we don't see translation of the excellent results that we see in clinical trial into real life. So I think the regulators may start expecting appropriate reflection of the ethnic and socially minority, social disparities of health impacted patient population in clinical studies. And that's how we can see whether the drug works or not. And that's the reason why I think a couple of immunotherapies approval has been kind of rescinded by regulators because there was not enough reflection of the data in the follow-up pharmacovigilance studies.
And you've been talking about some predictions around how oncology is going to evolve in the future, including various ways to address these inequities in care and clinical trial access, perhaps not fast enough. What else would you highlight as some of your top 2 or 3 predictions for the future evolution of oncology?
So I think I probably got distracted, but I think one thing I see is that there will be change in the payer. So there definitely will be value-based contracting. So if we look into the macro, so we can define the payer perspective, broader perspective, and industry perspective. From payer perspective, it's going to be some sort of ties to the cost of the treatment with the outcomes, and that also will bring in the provider in the picture by exposing them to some sort of minimal negative risk. So that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
There will be some step by the current government if you look into on addressing the pricing. When you look into IPI, there's a German model which seems to be being touted as one of the popular model within the current administration. So there will be some movement towards how do you bring in kind of some sort of impact on the Part B drug price.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of movement going around in the PBM space because, pharmacy benefit managers, they control a lot of relationship between a physician and a patient. And sometimes that could be adversarial because that could cause delay in the patient's kind of care.
Mm-hmm.
I also would see with the current government's desire, there may be some sort of universal healthcare model kind of initiatives. Not sure if it will go through the divided Senate and Congress, but that may be an effort on that part. From industry side, I think the clinical trials will have to be more inclusive than kind of more fragmented. There may be more impetus to get more small and mid-sized company practice to accrue more patients from the minority background, because FDA probably will slowly start mandating that piece. And from the provider side, I think there's going to be, with the 340B guidelines, where the 340B institutions will be paid at ASP minus 30%, there will be some sort of decentralization of the practices because oncologists are not anymore useful money minting machine to the institution, for lack of better words. I mean, I think consolidation happens because the large health system with 340B sees them as a potential kind of, cash machines where they can make more back-end profit on drugs, but that's going to be not going to be the case anymore. So decentralization of the delivery of care, I think gene therapy, cell therapy being more accepted, maybe a third of the drug will be virtually oral, a lot more precision medicine oriented treatment, and so on and so forth. And I think there will be more longevity as well. At the end of the day, people will be living longer and longer.
What is some general advice to manufacturers, since you brought them up, in this sort of future evolution of oncology care, delivery, reimbursement?
I would strongly recommend that start looking into the healthcare disparities, Krishna, because about 5-7 years back, when we were seeing the opioid overdose deaths, pharma were kind of, I wouldn't say they were turning blind eye, but they didn't think it was their responsibility. Nor the supply chain, nor the, look at the ABC, look at the McKessons of the world, look at the Cardinals of the world. And they were all in Wheeling, West Virginia last week in front of the court.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm seeing if there was actually a hallmark of what's coming, it's the judgment. I'll send you the link once we are done on this Hawaiian court's judgment saying that if your drug did not work in 6 out of 7 Pacific Islands that you treated, why didn't you disclose that? So I think try to be inclusive in a trial, try to have appropriate reflection and create what we call diversity and disparity initiatives in each company, because someday you'll be called in front of the government and say, yes, we realized that there was a huge amount of disparity between the different parts of the society. And what did you do? Because you were actually a large driver of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
You have interest of those people in mind. And I always bring Mahatma Gandhi in my conversation. So there were 2 sentences that stuck with me in my life. One was that, remember the face of the poorest and most depraved man in the society. And if what you do today, if it's going to make a difference in his life, then do it, not otherwise. And the other thing is the true measure of the society lies in how it looks after its most marginalized, underserved population. And I don't think we are there as yet. I think we have a way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And bringing inclusivity, diversity, equity, and access. And we cannot do it individually. We think that it's somebody else's responsibility. So, I was on a call with a peer a week back, and then we were discussing a case that had not responded to optimum treatment for depression. And I suggested doing pharmacogenomics. I said, if you don't have response, look into the genetic makeup, CYP3, all those enzymes, and see if she's metabolizing them. So the psychiatrist on call says, oh, that's a too fashion, it's not part of the psychiatry. And I had to send him the reports saying that this is exactly why we are creating a two-tier system. You have a problem in the patient, 40% of my cancer patients are on antidepressant or pain medicine. And if I don't look at their pharmacogenomics, I cannot serve them right. So coming back to, payer does not think it's their responsibility, pharma does not think it's their responsibility, lab does not think it's their responsibility. So who is responsible for that at the end?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Patel, you've mentioned precision medicine now several times. And I believe a quote from you was around how scientific innovation is moving at a pace where human capacity cannot keep up.
Yes.
And I love this quote because it really speaks to the other side of the coin. With all this innovation, there's also a lot to stay abreast of. And so how do you feel community oncologists are balancing that? And tell me more about, that quote.
So we are struggling, and it's not because we have inertia. I think at least last 1.5 years, the struggle has been compounded with the COVID-19. So it's hard to keep up with what you have to do for COVID-19 and what you have to do for precision medicine. I think the problem is there are too many companies that are offering multiple tests, but a lot of time their reps may not really be totally conversant with the what we call clinical utility piece. So we need to have almost like some sort of a Switzerland group, which is a coalition of precision medicine initiatives, but more like, something that's sponsored either by the labs or pharma, but that becomes Switzerland, not siding with one company versus the other, but allow all the companies to share common processes, evolve common standards, and then share that information with the providers. So from my perspective, we are just starting a precision medicine study going to address disparities. Precision medicine has a huge potential of becoming the problem solver as well, because if we take the precision medicine to rural areas and try to identify mutations in virtually every patient, we can create the bioinformatics and the biorepository and the biobank that can be used in future for new drug development.
Fast forwarding ahead, what do you anticipate will be some profound transformations that we'll see in cancer care?
In next 10 years, if I have a crystal ball, I think that virtually 3 out of 4 patients will be treated with the targeted therapies. That's one. Second is we'll be screening patients ahead of the cancer before doing the mammogram using the blood test. Third thing is we will not be waiting for the scan to show progression. We'll be looking at the MRD testing for relapse detection, and we'll be titrating medicine based on minimal residual disease measurement from liquid biopsy. So I think we will be shifting towards the liquid biopsy in next 5 years. I think most of the patients will be diagnosed, treated, and monitored using liquid biopsy. So the huge imaging machines either will have a special application or they probably will slowly start getting fossilized.
Well, Dr. Patel, I wanted to end on a high note, and that was certainly one. You do lead us to the flip side of this, which is the unsustainable cost of care that's coming with these innovations, whether it's cell therapy, novel combos, also just treat to progression over multi-year periods. What are some of your closing thoughts and advice also to manufacturers about how to address the unsustainability of the costs?
So we have to show the pharmacoeconomic modeling, Christina. If you look into this young kid who would have died in 2017. So he being a PhD, what he contributes back in quality adjusted life years, how much value he's going to bring to the society, which cannot be measured in terms of the dollar volume. We can always print more dollars. We cannot bring back the life. So 2 things I always tell my family members, my friends, is that we cannot generate time and we cannot bring life back to life. And I would sacrifice everything for that. So pharma has done a phenomenal. You just have to show the value in number of meaningful weeks, months, and years gained. In the broader scheme of events, say if oncology drugs cost say $120 billion a year right now, which is probably less than 3 to 4% of the total federal budget. But when you add, say, probably 3 more years to average life expectancy, and if you look at 1.2 million new cancer cases, we are adding about 2 million times 3 is 6 million years of life. And there's no value you can put that. So when you look into the average quality adjusted life years, which is measured in dollar volume, when you translate the 6 million additional years between all the pharma, all the innovation, all the just confined to cancer space, look at how much value you bring back. That should be the message. That should be the way. You should also say how much charity pharma is doing, how many free drugs are being given to patients who don't have insurance, how many drug replacement you do. Those are the stories that are not being told. And I would love to explore ways that we could create building up the story and messaging, which is not just about innovation microscope, which is about macro level of life contribution.